Hello, 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 and welcome to series 2 of The Communicators, an interview cast by Parisi. I'm Nick Connor, and this week we're thrilled to have Chris Marshall join us to find out what makes an effective communicator. Trained in finance and rooted in psychology, Chris explores how people adapt and thrive under pressure. An applied psychologist working within complex systems, particularly investment teams, Chris specializes in how uncertain identity and decision making interacts in high stake environments. Alongside clinical training as a psychotherapist, he holds a master in behavioral finance and is completing a PhD in psychology. Chris is also the founder of the Playfulness Lab, a non-for-profit play as a virtual capacity for creative resilience and problem solving. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for that intro. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you with us. Now, you work with teams operating under, constant uncertainty, ever-changing sands. How does that pressure actually change the way people think and make decisions?
Yeah, I mean, great kind of opening question. And I think it's probably appropriate to say that we all now live and work in a kind of highly uncertain, high pressure, fast moving, disruptive, chaotic, ambiguous. I mean, we could keep just adding words in there. I think we all feel it. Kind of when I started my research on this, I think it was more niche. So I was looking predominantly within the investment world, which is always an ambiguous and chaotic kind of environment, high pressure, high stakes. But yeah, how it actually changes our decision making. And I kind of apologize. I'm gonna have to keep getting a little bit sciencey here, but I think it's intuitive because we all experience it is as we enter into these environments which are constantly just throwing us into flux, there's a groundlessness to our current world that we live in. And as that happens, what we notice is normally a stress response kicks in. And the interesting thing here is the stress response is wonderful. I'm not here to kind of like bash the stress response or say it's bad or stress is bad. There's a reason why the human race is here, and it's a lot to do that we have this stress response. It's that the difference is that we're now living and working in a world which our biology and our nervous system it is not adapted to, and it probably will be in a couple of 100,000 years, but it's not going to happen today. And so, kind of where to put meat on the bone and maybe tell a story of this, so it doesn't just get into kind of a science podcast, is if we went back kind of a couple of 100,000 years ago, we were kind of very nomadic. We were living in caves, kind of. We wanted the stress response to kick in when there was a perceived threat or uncertainty in our environment. It could have been the smell of a lion outside the cave. It could have been just a weird noise that isn't familiar. And in those instances, I think everyone recognizes we get this kind of instant fight and flight response. Your hairs literally stand up because it's the tightening of the skin ready for physical kind of conflict. Um, the whole system changes. If you're digesting food, will actually pause or slow down, and more blood will go to the muscles. You're preparing yourself for this environment where huge physical danger could be around the corner. When we're not in that state, it's not that we're just simply not stressed. We're not nothing. We're not stressed or nothing. We orientate towards joy and playfulness at the other end of the spectrum. Um, but our modern world, instead of having lions outside our front doors, most people thankfully don't suffer that. We have this environment in this world which is constantly triggering our stress response and constantly pinning us in that area when actually it's no longer helpful because it's not a physical life-threatening danger that we're facing. It's somebody's cut us up on the road on the way to work, or I don't know, our boss has emailed saying, why isn't this report in yesterday? And so the response we're getting is one which is very well attuned. Now, how does it change decision making? That's kind of your question, but hopefully with that foundation, we can layer it on top. What we notice is that as we kind of go into those survival responses, thankfully our thinking changes too. So we become far more pessimistic. If there's a lion outside the kind of the front door or the cave, the kind of face of the cave, you don't want to be optimistic. You don't want to be playful. You want to be fairly rigid. You want to be defensive. You want to actually kind of really look after self and be very, very short time focused, i.e., preserve now, not think about, oh, well, what am I going to plant that might yield me crops in 10 years' time? Or bring it to today. I wouldn't think about, oh, well, where am I going to move the business in 10 years? I'm in a survival response. It's all about now. So we have this kick in. Now, as you can probably see from that answer, in the modern world, we don't want to, to kind of have all of these amazing stress responses kick in. We want to be able to stay optimistic or even optimal in our thinking. We still want to be able to access abstract thinking, not rigidity. We don't want to be closed off and defended. We want actually be able to come closer to others for cooperation and kind of shared meaning making and creativity and everything else. But we're fighting our biology. We're fighting this nervous system. And so, yeah, in our modern world where we're constantly stressed, where we're constantly feeling this pressure of chaos and what's next, and is my job threatened? Is my career threatened by AI or shifting geopolitical things or whatever else? Essentially, we're entering into this mindset and the way of thinking that's very, very well honed for a couple of 100,000 years ago, but it doesn't necessarily yield the best decisions and kind of output because we need to access something differently. And that's really kind of where a lot of my research goes now.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And one thing I didn't mention in the intro is, you've had a pedigree in sport. You skied at quite a high level, and I guess you entered psychology from originally from things you learnt whilst being an athlete. And what you find, if you go on Instagram, you hear about psychology, you hear a lot of it in sporting context, which in my mind makes a lot of sense because lots of sport has developed from how do you run away from a lion, or how do you throw a spear at a lion, so actually that makes sense. It taps into that to that originality. But if you are 20-year career working in finance and you have to hit monthly targets and you hit that monthly target, but then you start again looking at next quarter, or you're a founder and the business you started, you have years of it's not a fast need to move away of danger, it's a constant. And it's not a physical one, it's a mental one.
Yeah, yeah.
How's the lion being outside versus the lion being, I guess, inside? How's that different?
Massively. And you've brought me kind of, I guess, whether you know this or not, Nick, you've brought me to kind of a personal story of how I got to where my research is. You're absolutely right. So I came through elite sport. I was on the British ski team. I then coached members who were then in the British ski team. So I've kind of worked in elite sport both as an athlete and a coach. I then entered finance weeks before the great financial crisis. I didn't know I was entering it weeks before the great financial crisis. And kind of I had at that point a very, very weak handle on the technicalities of finance and investment and things, as you do when you enter a new career. But what I had was this kind of experience and massive amounts of knowledge about performance psychology. And I saw it just play out in front of me in kind of the attitudes and decision making of investment managers. Some were completely frozen with fear, didn't know what to do. They were kind of capitulating, i.e., they were selling stuff at kind of almost record lows just to get out, anything just for find a little bit of safety. And there were those who, I'm not going to say they were happy, but they were prepared. They had a different mindset. They were approaching it very differently. And I could go, okay, I don't really understand the technicalities at this point. I'm a couple of weeks into this new career in finance, but I can understand the mindset. I've seen this before on the in the competitive environment. That's then what made me go and do my master's focusing on behavioral finance. So I was looking at resiliency and mental toughness in investment managers because they're kind of like the gold standard. That's how we put it across. And they're certainly the gold standard in elite sport and military circles. And they're amazing. Again, just as I said with stress, my job here is not to say, oh, mental toughness and resiliency are rubbish. They're not. They're amazing. And if you can develop that in yourself, yes, you can push through. But the important point you've just raised is we've borrowed an awful lot of thinking from elite sports and military, which is where a lot of the mental toughness and resiliency research was done. And we've just simply gone, oh, okay, as a founder, as an executive, as kind of anybody working in a knowledge intensive environment, certainly the commercial environment, we picked it up and go, oh, I could use some of that. If this means I can just push through when things get tough, that sounds great. My personal experience was I was setting up a couple of businesses. I kind of was researching mental toughness and resiliency, and I hospitalized myself with burnout. I spent 3 days in hospital, and I mean the irony of me being a researcher in mental toughness and resiliency and being actually still succumbing to burnout wasn't lost. I sat there just going, hold on a minute. If I can't get this, and I've done the training as an elite athlete, and now I'm researching it as a scientist, well, surely I'm missing something. Surely we're missing something. And the difference is that time frame. In sport and military, you have campaigns, you have race seasons, you have events. And during those kind of very small time frames, absolutely, pushing through when things get tough is an essential quality. But we can't directly transcribe it over to the commercial world, where, as you say, every day is race day. Every minute is filled with, I need to push forward on this project. Something else is going wrong. You're constantly doing it. You don't have an off season. You might have a couple of weeks of vacation, but that's completely different to this kind of a cycle of intensive training, race time, downtime, rest days. We we just don't build business like that. And so the bit that we have to make sure we get in there is mental toughness and resiliency are all about when bad things happen, we stay the same. We push forward. We just kind of like get our head down and we don't give up. There's something beyond that in the human being, which is far more, i.e., bad things can happen and we can grow, and we don't have to just be rigid. When we're kind of talking about extending the time frame out, that's very important because we need adaptability and flexibility, not just plow forward, whatever the cost. And that's really where all my research on playfulness came through, was that is the bit that if we can maintain curiosity and creativity and connectedness, the three kind of pillars I see as playfulness, then it's a far more sustainable way of being adaptive under constant pressure, under this kind of environment where things aren't just busy for 1 minute. They're busy for 1 year, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So yeah, that's kind of how I'd put it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And when you talk about getting into that playfulness state of mind, I think it's worth us talking about that in more detail in a second. But I've just got, I guess, a question. Something I always think about, and take it back to a sport. And my questions around sort of personality and environment. But I always think about rugby and how even the smallest guy, it could tackle the biggest guy. And you think, well, they're professional rugby players. They're probably born with that. No, they're probably not. And if you go down and watch a third team play rugby, you see the smallest guy not tackling. But actually, it's nothing physical. It's nothing there. It's probably potentially the competitive environments that professionals come through, but they're probably not naturally gifted at tackling those big guys. So there's probably something around the environment which has made them being a good tackler, a good defender, and getting into that psychological things. So adapting it from sport into sort of into sort of more sort of desk job world. How much does your personality, you have and developed, and the environment you're in dictates who you are and how you operate, particularly in high pressure situations. And how can you, within your own personality and environment, adapt?
Yeah, I mean, huge question, and we could literally talk about this for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, as this is kind of part of the focus of my PhD research. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right that the environment sets kind of parameters and boundaries of who we can be. I think we've looked at this very much from a personality point of view previously, i.e., are you, Nick, kind of bringing these characteristics? Do you have these in your personality? It's been a very big business for a lot of companies. I'm not going to throw those names under the bus, but the big personality trait testing companies out there that companies love to go and do. I have two big issues with this. One is personality traits aren't fixed. We've kind of if you're gonna like screen people on personality traits, you have to believe your personality is fixed and we know what we're buying almost when we hire you. Research shows that they're not fixed, they change over time. But secondly, it's highly individualized, and this is a very Western way of thinking that it's all about you as an individual or me as an individual. If anything's going wrong, it must be located in that person. Where I'm kind of taking this is that actually the environments we create, both in kind of we can talk about teams, we can talk about big organizations, the climate, not necessarily the culture, but the climate, i.e., how do you show up, matters massively. And that's where you can get these kind of personality traits coming out, i.e., I'll throw this back to you and the listeners really, is you will know that you have these fairly enduring personality traits. So that, yes, they can change, but they're fairly constant for a while, and then they might shift as you move into a different phase of life. But who you show up in different environments can be a very different person. I.e., Nick showing up to work is probably a different person than the Nick I know when, like, for everyone listening, we went to school together. If we show up with friends, it's a different version of you. Again, and probably a different version of you with your family. It's probably a different version depending on which part of your family. So still the same personality. You're still Nick. We're not talking about multiple personalities here, but just different parts of you come out and different parts come to the fore. And when we're talking about that within teams and organizations, we have paid such little attention to kind of the environment in which people show up. We also, I don't think we've paid enough attention to how that affects decision making and how we optimize so much in the athletics world for kind of like physical performance, and yet the business world doesn't optimize for decision making quality. It's just kind of hopefully you turn up and you make some good decisions and then you go home. There's nothing really kind of tangible. But yeah, the environment piece, absolutely massive. You can invite people into a space where they can be more creative. Equally, you will know of teams and businesses, I'm sure we've all kind of got experience of this, where they unfortunately invite you to be a far lesser person than you could be, that you don't bring much of yourself to that environment. And, we can describe those as toxic or suppressive or whatever else. But yeah, environment's massive.
And that's really interesting. The most you talk about sort of the environment and putting people in boxes, as it were, is actually the business model of sort of management consultancies. The most famous example being the McKinsey way, and the whole point of the McKinsey way is you can literally pull someone off the street, say this is how we do it, and you get the outcome you desire. They built frameworks. Is there a alternative framework? And let's bring in maybe a bit more definition of what is playfulness. So it's something you've mentioned before, we haven't actually maybe tackled
Defined.
yet. What exactly, what is playfulness, and maybe how can you use it to make decisions? And you have the McKenzie way, so what's the playfulness way?
Okay, nice. So let's start by defining it because again, this is one of the things I kind of come up against a lot. Is unfortunately again kind of in our culture for the last few hundred years, we have kind of categorized play and playfulness as the same thing. Also, kind of going on in the background here, like we can go all the way back to thinkers such as Rene Descartes, who, kind of told us, okay, well, actually, rational, logical, deductive thinking is far better than emotional thinking. And we've spent, like, as I said, these few hundred years running with that idea, emotions and kind of more playful styles of thinking and creating and everything else kind of being seen as a second tier. So, again, everyone can kind of relate to this, that as a kid, we're not only like kind of encouraged to be playful, it's built into like national curriculums and for very good reason, because it's core to social, emotional, physical development. Then we become adults and we're kind of slowly taught, okay, well, chuck that out the window. Now it's time to be stressed and serious. And it's the weirdest kind of thing that kind of goes on. But I think it's partly because we don't understand what playfulness is. As I said, we confuse it with play. Play, I would define very easily as involvement in an activity or a game. So it could be playing rugby, as we've talked about. It could be playing a board game. It could be, I don't know, playing around with friends. So that's an activity, and it's got limited application in my view in the world of work. So I can see where we've kind of gone on this path. But playfulness is different. Playfulness is a state of being. It's a place your nervous system is firing from. It's a kind of we could call it a kind of a state of thinking if you wanted. That has application everywhere because again, we're not needing to be playing a game. We're bringing a style of thinking now to whatever activity it is we're doing, whether it's this podcast, whether it's kind of a really high pressure team meeting where things have gone really wrong. You could go down the route of logical, rational, deductive thinking and kind of calling people out, and these are the facts. Or you can actually open up that environment and go, okay, like we have monumentally gone wrong here. And let's just kind of unpick this. Let's kind of play around with it. What on earth went on? You will get two completely different sets of answers from that situation. And I would argue from everything I've seen in the companies I've worked with, that latter one is far richer because people share, people open up, people are vulnerable. And so that's where playfulness fits in. And you'll know it from if you've raised your own kids, you'll know it that playfulness can diffuse tension. It can lighten a really heavy message. It can help reduce perceived stress. Actually, coming back to this idea of a shifting world, playfulness allows us to sit in liminality. So, i.e., that space between, the space of unknowing. And I honestly think that's one of the greatest strengths in a world which is changing. Because if you consider the opposite, i.e., we just jump to a conclusion, which is often like the leadership model and management model that has been historically in place, the person that shouts the loudest with the most confidence, well, they're a great leader. Now, in a moving environment, fast moving environment, the person who can sit and go, I don't know, but let's just explore together and let's find out what the answer is, and perhaps even find out what the question is. That's a far more playful state and place. So hopefully that kind of defines those two and some of the applications for it.
Yeah, let's play devil's advocate, like yourself. That I worked in finance for a bit, and just a stereotype. There is definitely a certain type of baby boomer guy who works in finance who goes, I don't want these guys, playing around here. I want them to bring X value per quarter. I want them to get deals done. What would you say to them? How would you, maybe give a practical example of how playfulness can help, the commercial teams, put value back onto the chart?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's always a key thing. And I get it. I get that there always needs to come back to the bottom line. Businesses are in business at the end of the day to make profit. And I think the first key bit is we now have enough research to show that the employee's experience of work, if it's positive, then it actually adds significantly to the bottom line. So we're not talking about, oh, okay, well, playfulness can maybe just make this a nicer place to work. It's actually what we're talking about is we're shifting the employee's experience of work. And actually we can empirically link that to an increase in, well, I mean, we could go down the whole reduced kind of turnover of staff, increased retention of staff, reduced burnout, but also an increasing bottom line, i.e., productivity and profitability in environments and organizations where the employee experience is measured and kind of worked on, i.e., there's a positive employee experience, are more profitable than those which essentially don't really care about the human. So, I mean, that's the first argument is always increasing playfulness isn't about sacrificing profit. And again, I think that's partly a confusion of play and playfulness. Play we kind of see as, oh, okay, well, this isn't really commercial. This isn't really anything to do with making money. It's just a bit of fun. As I said, playfulness doesn't have to be that. We can use the playful environment and all the things that I think we should have learned as kids, i.e., like we're just so much more creative, more curious, more connected to everyone else when we're in this state of playfulness and bring it into that space. So yeah, and specifically on finance, because obviously I've done a lot of work in there, is you find the best traders are actually the ones who they don't necessarily, I'm going to use some technical words here, they don't necessarily have like better hit rates, i.e., the positions they're taking, they're not understanding the world in a kind of a genius fashion that everything they buy just turns to gold. What they're doing is they're being far more adaptable. And there's this beautiful phrase in investment management, which is strong convictions loosely held. And it's the hardest thing to actually achieve. So you have this really strong conviction behind a position, but at any point you've got to be able to go, I'm wrong. And that's to me is being playful because you're considering the opposite. You're considering what don't I know? Like where are my limitations in this thought that I've come up with? So within the investment space, and I think this is true probably within founders and kind of fast scaling businesses, that's constantly needed. Being more adaptable, being more flexible, seeing what is missing, not just what you already know to be true, significantly changes like kind of how you work and I think how you generate profits.
The thing I've learned, 20 odd years being in the workplace, the smartest people I come across, some really, really, really smart people are very fortunate to work with who've done some amazing things, but they're always the ones who ask stupid questions. They just don't, and again, maybe this comes back to personality and environment, and maybe because they have almost all sort of Oxbridge and gone through that route where, and imagine that school, they were always clever, so they've always had that confidence to being stupid, I guess, because they know they're not, and they will ask all the basic questions, but they know they need to ask those basic questions to get the foundations to understand something, to then take it to that next level. And
Yeah.
and particularly someone like myself who probably hasn't come from that background, I personally have always come in with a bit of a guard. I don't want to look stupid, I don't want to ask that question, show my weakness here. So there's something there, isn't there, about sort of letting, sort of trying to tap into a different way of thinking to improve.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, essentially, what you're describing there is, and I think we all have it to some degree. So don't beat yourself up, Nick. Um, but we all have it to some degree because there is a fear attached to asking a question which seems so basic, or everyone else in the room seems to just be nodding along with, like, kind of just going, "Oh yeah, yeah, that'd be a great idea," and you're sat there just going, "I don't even understand the words they're using," and there's a fear of just going, "Oh, can you define that?" Because we are highly social creatures and there's fear of judgment of others. There's a fear of looking stupid, a fear of failure, kind of all of these different things going on. And again, we have built a modern society very much on kind of success is me knowing this stuff, me delivering value rather than asking questions which seem basic. But again, bring this back to kind of a playful space. And I think a company that does this extraordinarily well. So Sarah Blakely's company, Spanx, so women's shapewear, she has these kind of weekly meetings called Oops meetings. And the whole point of them is they come together and they talk about the mistakes they've made that week. Um, it just doesn't happen in so many businesses because those are the bits that people try and bury. Oh, it never happened. Oh, no, no, I don't want to talk about that. Uh, but set the right environment. And in even her phrasing, an oops meeting, it's not, I don't know, she could easily have called it a what we've done wrong this week meeting or kind of, I don't know, stringing up employees meeting or whatever else. But there's a playful tint to it. And that playful space allows people just to ask dumb questions. And often they're not dumb questions. We all know this, that in that meeting, let's go back to kind of that idea that everyone else is nodding along and you ask that question. All of a sudden, there's often a lightness that's created in the room because everyone goes, "Oh, thank goodness Nick asked that because I had no clue. I was just acting along." like kind of imposter syndrome, beating everybody. But yeah, so playful spaces just allow us to let our guard down. We're less concerned about the judgment of others when we're in a playful space. Um,
Yeah, I'm
so
I'm
yeah,
I'm now two questions over what I should have, stopped this avenue, but I'm now in, and you talk about those oops meetings. Something I'm fascinated. Well, there's two things I'm going to try and bring in here just to have it in one question, so we can move along here. There's two bits I've been fascinated for years. One is the medical, when someone um, they're trying to build a new framework of working out what went wrong during operations. And the framework where they went with is the air crashes, where it's no
yeah,
blame culture. How did this plane? Well, it doesn't matter. No one's going to be blamed. We just want to get to the root causes, and they then try to adapt this to medical. It's not your. No one's going to get blamed for this operation going wrong. We just need to learn from our mistakes.
yeah.
But then, that's a very clear framework, and it takes a lot to not bring blame culture in,
Mm.
which takes us to personality. And there is a connection. There's this brilliant research by I think it was by Harvard. It might have been Harvard Business School, where they looked at schools and they looked at head teachers, and basically saying, certain personality types sees different results in a teacher going into an underperforming school. And what they found is the PE teacher, fantastic, really quick, sharp results, and that school, performs really well. But then there's a big dip. So in some sense, that's a personality. If you look at a salesperson, really great, throwing lots of deals, but can they sustain that level over and over and over? Right. But then they found sort of a geography teacher. It's much more slower, it's much more gradual, but the school improves, and it's much more leisured. So bringing in sort of like understanding how we all work, sort of no blame culture, but within sort of the different personality, traits involved in it. If you were, a founder, and you are set up a brilliant, science technology company, how can you bring all that in to, make the team work? Different personalities, different frameworks. How can you bring that all in to basically build a fantastic, amazing company?
Yeah, I mean that's yeah, another huge question. Um, and I think, to some degree, I mean, let's talk about kind of some of the attributes of playfulness in terms of climate and things, because I think that's where, this is important as well. Is yes, there are some obvious things with playfulness. Yes, you increase creativity. Yes, you increase engagement from staff. Yes, you increase kind of overall well-being because, who doesn't like to be in an environment which is more playful than, I don't know, suppressed or toxic? These are really basic things. But I think one of the things which is often overlooked is, and this is a fascinating stream of research within adult playfulness, is that actually increases empathy. So when we're playful, we're more empathetic, or kind of to be specific around the research, more playful people are more empathetic. Um, and so we're now talking about kind of emotional intelligence, empathy, understanding others' positions. Um, and so for me, kind of one of the areas which I find fascinating, I'm neurodivergent, so I'm autistic and ADHD, which, creates its own wonderful mix of things within me. But obviously, I therefore have a bias towards looking at how do you build more diverse cultures and climates that work together, and really kind of pull on the strengths of everybody. Because I've got to be honest, like whenever I've gone into a team or organization, I've never seen it kind of be the problem be, oh my word, your staff don't know what they're doing, or they're not very talented. You walk in and there's a plethora of talent. I mean, you've got the best people you could possibly find, and yet for some reason it doesn't work. And so when we start looking at playful cultures, kind of one of the aspects is about increasing this space of diversity. Because, as we've just talked about with failure and kind of mistakes, playfulness also opens up this space where I'm now more curious. So I kind of talk about this. So my model of playfulness is what's called the three pillars model. And so it's curiosity, creativity, and connectedness. And where you get tremendous kind of stuff about what you're talking about here, about kind of bringing together, celebrating and kind of empowering people from very different mindsets and different backgrounds, is that connection between connectedness, i.e., intro and interpersonal intelligence, and the curiosity. Because if I have those two in my team, and we can kind of diagnostically look at this within kind of, okay, well, what areas are your team strong in? It could be very creative, but not very connected. And so when we start diagnostically looking at this, we actually go, okay, there's a weakness here. And actually, how do we strengthen those two pillars? Because we know when those two pillars are in place, all of a sudden you now get this kind of empathetic leadership style of I'm fascinated. I'm no longer defensive about this is my thoughts, and my thoughts must be better than your thoughts, so your thoughts must be wrong. That's the recipe for toxic cultures and everything else. Um, when you have those two in abundance, it's like the playful space becomes, okay, that's really weird, Nick, because like all of my thinking points me in this direction. And you're saying the answers are lives completely over that way. Like, how on earth did you come up there? And that's a very different conversation to like, no, I've done my research and I know my thinking and you're wrong. Now we're co-creating things. So now we're coming into creativity. So I think from a diversity point of view and like lots of different backgrounds, playfulness has so much to offer because it encourages that kind of that curious exploration and understanding. I think one of the basic kind of things of playfulness is that we start to realize that we don't know everything, and that's fine. Like we know a certain amount, but there's so much we're missing, and you might have the answers to what I don't know. So that kind of makes sense.
No, that's perfect. And what we want to do is take this conversation about how organizations can use this and type of data. But before we do that, I just want to tell the listeners a little bit more about Parisi. Parisi is a specialist in communications, helping organizations achieve their commercial objectives, whether that's raising their profiles, boosting revenue, or attracting new clients and investors. We combine traditional PR and public affairs engagements with marketing and content-led strategies focused on delivering the outcomes our clients need, not just ticking boxes. Now, as I just teased there a second, Chris, how can organizations use data? So lots of organizations collect lots of data and they use public range of data. How can they use that data to understand the psychology and what really matters to their audience? So not just observing sort of behaviors of sort of their clients or prospect investors. How can they use sort of data and then adapt it into sort of a playfulness model?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it probably, for me, obviously it comes back to this model I was just talking about that I have. And I think it's understanding kind of where they sit right now, in terms of those three pillars of curiosity, creativity, connectedness. Because again, where we find where those three are kind of in balance, that's where you have a highly playful climate. And we can bring this to the individual. If, as an individual, if we are highly curious, creative, and connected, we're a highly playful individual. And so all we're doing is just scaling that up to kind of if we have those three parameters within a climate, it becomes a highly playful team. And again, coming back to that idea of playfulness as being cognitively flexible, very open space where people can share and feel safe. Um, not necessarily turning up to work in a clown suit. Uh, so I mean that's always the starting point, and data is so important because it's always that thing of if you're not aware of something or you're not measuring something, how do you know what it is and where you're headed? Um, so so that's kind of always the starting point is taking an initial assessment and then really working out, okay, well, what's missing? And for me, I think what's really fascinating about this area is I come at this from playfulness is kind of the default state of the human being when it's in a state of well-being. So we talked about stress response. When we're not stressed, we're not nothing. We're playful and joyous. And what's interesting in terms of modern organizations is most interventions that managers do, if it's trying to change culture or climate, is it's an addition. So, okay, I'm going to send you on a course so that you can be, I don't know, have more, whatever it might be, and we're going to train you to do this. And that's lovely, but I think it actually misses the point. And what I'm trying to say is playfulness is what happens when we remove the barriers to it, i.e., it's the state that we should be in more and more, and yet we find most adults find they're in it less and less. And so the point is you don't teach somebody. I can't teach you to be playful, Nick. You already know how to be playful. You've already had that training as a kid, and it's wonderful and it's there. And if you ever find in life that you're not playful, it's actually that the work is not to train to be playful again. It's not like, oh my word, I've forgotten how to be playful. It's, well, what's standing in the way? What's blocking it? And I think it's a far more kind of kind and softer approach to change than we're used to in organizations. Um, but it's understanding that actually, if we get the environment right, these things naturally emerge rather than we have to train our staff to be more playful. And also understanding that actually you don't develop playfulness by playing games. I'm going to completely bash kind of a lot of like the kind of corporate team building world. I hate it. Personally, I absolutely hate it when people turn up with spaghetti and flipping marshmallows and like they believe this is going to change the whole company. You get half the group who feel completely awkward, which I'm in, and then you get the other group who are normally the loudest anyway, who just like kind of go for it. But by Monday morning, everything's just snapped back to where it was, and it was a complete and utter waste of time. And so, playfulness, really, when we come to understand it, is about human thriving. And I guess that's my mission at the Playfulness Lab, the not for profit, is I don't understand why we have to see work and life as this kind of balance. Why can't we build workplaces which are truly enriching? Truly, actually, we go there and we find and develop a better version of ourselves during that time. Why can't they be enriching like we have with theatres or art galleries or anything else? I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. It's just we've never really tried to do it. And so, yeah, coming back to, I think I'm probably way off your question here, but it always starts with data. You have to understand it, understand what's missing, but then it's not a case of installing. It's a case of actually unlearning normally. We've got so many things in the way, and I certainly see this. Kind of one of the things we perhaps haven't touched on is, I run a small private practice of psychotherapy and coaching. And often that's the place where I work one-on-one with a leader. And it's about unpicking and unlearning some of the things which prevent them from entering that space. And it could be anything. I mean, it could actually be anything, values, beliefs, past trauma, stress, whatever it might be. But we can also do that work as an organization of understanding what's blocking this route. Um, so yeah, that's
Yeah,
that's kind of how I position
yeah,
it.
yeah. I'm interested in learning more about the blocking. So, background. We're very proud to have you as a member of the Prissy Collective, which means organisations can, through us, we can bring you in to help us, bring some playfulness into different elements. And one thing, many, sort of our clients, they have a blocker.
Mhm.
That could be, investor not understanding or not in the place to understand the proposition of this company. Let's say they're they've developed a new material which is going to improve satellites. How can they open the gateways for someone to understand or be in the place to understand this long-term investment and what that could bring. But it could be a government minister. They're very set on a manifesto pledge, but not in the place to listen to saying, well, actually, this is really hurting businesses here. You need to understand this. So these blocking elements, how can companies use this in a more, sort of communications way of bringing in sort of opening, using playfulness to open that bit of the brain?
Yeah, so again, I think this probably comes back to some of the ideas of just understanding what happens naturally when you're in a playful state is that there is a kind of a relaxation. And actually that's it's kind of deep breath and just okay, what have I been missing in this tunnel vision? Which all of us can fall into. Certainly, we have deadlines, to-do lists, kind of like, I don't know, quarterly shareholder meetings or whatever it might be. And those things are all pressurizing. Again, I think it probably comes back to this idea of when we're in a highly stressed place, then our thinking narrows, we become more rigid, we fall back to kind of key things of coping mechanisms, of ways we've always done it. When we when we learn to actually either create environment which allows us to step out of that, it's not about never being in that space. Stress is a high energy state that can help us kind of get things done. It's important. But when we create that environment, either individually or collectively, that we can step out of it. So emotions we now know, by the way, should only last 90 seconds. So if you find you're still angry with your wife, like kind of like 3 years on, it's nothing to do with the emotion itself being there. You've constantly fed it. Okay. So like emotions should kind of come in, response should tick on and then tick off if the threat isn't real. So we're creating environments where perceived stress can be diffused. I think that's the key, one of the keys to understanding the playful kind of way. And when you do that, you naturally kind of like open up your thinking. You can consider it from different perspectives. You become a lot more, you engage in kind of a beautiful stream of thinking. So I used to like start conferences when I spoke to audiences. This was like after COVID when we kind of came back. Quite cruel. I guess it was quite playful, not cruel. But always used to start with like, where do you have your best thinking? And I used to say, I'm going to raise your hand when I say the location. And the opening joke was I always used to start with the office and nobody put their hand up. And you're kind of like, this is ironic, isn't it? Because like these are our places where we go to think and do our best thinking, yet nobody says they are. As soon as you start saying locations like the beach, the shower, on holiday, everybody's hand, at that point, those three, 99.9% of the audience is like, yes, that's where I have my best thinking. It's not that those locations are magic. I've heard of like kind of like some people like taking showers to try and juice out thinking. That obviously doesn't really work. What you're identifying is you've entered a different neurobiological state, a new space, a more playful state where you can just let things come in and go, and you can explore them far more abstract way. And so coming back to the blocks, kind of yes, sometimes there are things that people individually need to work through, i.e., a traumatic situation long, long ago that still gets constantly triggered. But I'm going to say that's very different to what we're talking about. But if you can allow a collective, a group, a team, an organization to enter this abstract thinking space more often, i.e., one which is safe to explore. And again, I have to be careful because, some founders at this point going, yeah, but I want my team to work and I want to be more productive. This isn't against productivity. It's just allowing a different style of thinking to come in, not so linear. Um, then instantly in that space, you start to orientate towards the other. So like kind of I often talk about in communication, there's your view, my view, and our view. There's always at least three perspectives. And so what we're creating in a team is that our view, which is far more connected to who you are, whether that's a client, whether that's how you're putting across a keynote speech, how you're putting across, I don't know, an argument or whatever else. If you only ever come from me, you're completely and utterly disconnected from the other person. Um, and so I think it's a lot to do with where our state is firing as well. And once we're in that kind of that place where we can start considering the other and the space in between, the intersubjective state, then all of a sudden things start to shift by themselves. There's kind of beautiful spillover effects because, again, come back to that idea of awareness. Once you're aware of that and you're aware of stress states and where am I firing? So often with investment managers, I kind of will say to them, if you're finding yourself in a majorly stressed position, like literally, please don't make any decisions because it's the worst place you can make a decision from. Find a way of down regulating again. Sometimes that's the work of just taking a pause, not a stop, just a pause, down regulating, and then all of a sudden your thinking's different. And again, we can apply these things in organizations. to completely shift how things are communicated and how we take on board other people's views.
I have about 6 more questions, but as we enter the second hour, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to say thank you very much for your time, Chris. This could easily be a 6-hour podcast. Anyway, I've been Nick Connor, and you've been listening to The Communicators, the interview series by Parisi. If you have any questions for Chris, which I know you will, drop them in the comments, and don't forget to give the podcast a like. Thank you.